When the most important event in history happened, only one person was there to see it. It wasn't Peter, it wasn't John. It was a woman who for centuries was labeled a prostitute without a single line of scripture confirming it. The tomb was empty, and she was the first to know. Her name is Mary Magdalene, and her real story was buried beneath layers of distortion that began in the 6th century. To understand how this happened, you need to go back to the beginning. Not to the beginning of the era, but to the beginning of the woman. The name Magdalene is not a surname. It's a geographical reference. She was Mary of Magdala, a city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. This already says something important. In 1st century Jewish culture, women were identified by their father's name, husband's name, or son's name. Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary, wife of Clopas, but Mary Magdalene is identified by the city she came from. This means, with very high probability, that she had her own social autonomy. She didn't depend on a man to be publicly recognized. And in 1st century Galilee, autonomy meant resources. It meant position. It meant that when she entered a room, people knew who she was. Luke chapter 8 verses 1 to 3 introduces Mary Magdalene for the first time in the Gospels. The text is straightforward. Jesus traveled through cities and villages preaching the kingdom of God, and with him were the 12 disciples and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. The first woman named in the list is Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. And the text continues saying that these women served Jesus and the disciples with their own resources. This is the original biblical record. 7 demons expelled and financial support for the ministry. No mention of prostitution, no mention of sexual sin, no mention of repentance from immoral life, no insinuation, direct or indirect. The text speaks of demonic possession and supernatural healing, not of moral conduct. And here is the first point that changes everything when you read carefully. Demonic possession in the biblical context was never synonymous with sexual sin. The Gospels record dozens of cases of people possessed by demons, men, women, children. The boy who threw himself into fire and water, described in Mark chapter 9, was not a sinner. He was tormented since childhood by a spirit that physically destroyed him. The man of Gadara who lived among the tombs, described in Mark chapter 5, walked naked, cut himself with stones, and screamed day and night. He wasn't immoral. He was a spiritual prisoner of an entire legion of demons. In none of these cases, nor in any other case recorded in the Gospels, does the biblical text associate demonic possession with prostitution or any form of sexual sin. 7 demons indicate intensity of spiritual affliction, severity of torment, not the nature of sin committed. And when Jesus freed Mary from these 7 demons, the text indicates that she was healed, not that she was forgiven. The language is of health restoration, not of guilt absolution. But then, if the biblical texts never called Mary Magdalene a prostitute, where did this idea come from that became so universal that even today it dominates popular imagination? The answer has a name, date, and address. In the year 591 after Christ, Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great, one of the most influential pontiffs in church history, preached Homily 33 at the Basilica of San Clemente in Rome. And in that homily, before a congregation that heard every word as unquestionable truth, he did something that no biblical text authorizes. He merged 3 completely different women into a single person. The first woman is Mary Magdalene, mentioned in Luke chapter 8, healed of 7 demons, financier of the ministry. The second is the anonymous sinner of Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. This woman is described only as a sinner in the city. She entered the house of Simon, a Pharisee, during a dinner. She brought an alabaster jar with perfume. She positioned herself behind Jesus, at his feet, crying. The tears wet Jesus' feet. She dried them with her own hair, kissed the feet and anointed them with perfume. The Pharisee thought to himself that if Jesus were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman was touching him. Jesus responded with the parable of the two debtors and told the woman that her sins were forgiven. The text doesn't give her name. It doesn't say she was Mary. It doesn't say she was from Magdala. It doesn't specify what the sin was. Popular tradition interpreted sinner as a euphemism for prostitute, but the Greek text uses hamartolos, which simply means sinner, without specification of nature. The third woman is Mary of Bethany, sister of Lazarus and Martha, mentioned in John chapter 11 and 12, a devout woman who sat at Jesus' feet to hear his teachings, and who anointed his feet with pure nard before the crucifixion. Gregory the Great looked at these three separate accounts, in different narrative contexts, written by different authors, situated at different moments in gospel chronology, and declared they were the same person. The anonymous sinner of Luke 7, Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene became a single woman in the imagination of Western Christianity. And since the anonymous sinner was associated with sin, possibly sexual, and since Mary Magdalene had 7 demons, Gregory concluded that the 7 demons actually represented the 7 deadly sins, with lust being the most prominent. In his own words, he declared that Mary used perfume to perfume her own flesh in forbidden acts, and that the hair that once served to adorn the face now served to dry Christ's feet. The most famous repentant prostitute in history wasn't born in the Gospels. She was born in a 6th century Roman pulpit from the mouth of a pope who read 3 different texts and decided they were one. The effect was devastating and permanent for more than a millennium. Gregory's homily wasn't the personal opinion of an obscure priest in a rural parish. It was an official declaration by the Bishop of Rome, the supreme spiritual leader of Western Christianity, the man whose word carried the weight of doctrine. And when the Pope spoke, the message spread like canon law throughout Christian territory. Preachers in every diocese of Europe incorporated the merger into their sermons. Catechists taught entire generations that Magdalene was the redeemed prostitute. The story became a centerpiece of Christian moral pedagogy. The message was convenient and powerful. If even a prostitute could be forgiven by Jesus, then any sinner could have hope. The problem is that the basis of the message was false. Artists began to paint Mary Magdalene according to Gregory's version. Long, loose hair, symbol of sensuality. Suggestive or semi-nude clothing. Repentant gaze turned to heaven. Perfume jars at her feet, tears streaming. The iconography crystallized in hundreds of Renaissance and Baroque works that became better known than the biblical texts themselves. Titian painted the penitent Magdalene with partially exposed breasts, hair covering her body. Caravaggio painted Martha reproaching Magdalene, portrayed as a worldly woman holding a mirror, symbol of vanity. El Greco painted the penitent in ecstasy, teary eyes turned upward. Georges de la Tour painted Magdalene meditating by candlelight, human skull before her, symbol of mortality and repentance. These images circulated through churches, palaces, and museums throughout Europe. And they were more effective than any sermon, because most people in the Middle Ages and Renaissance didn't read the Gospels in Greek or Latin. They received the biblical narrative through images, stained glass, and oral preaching. And all these sources repeated the same error. The merger spread to devotional literature, to medieval hagiographies, and to popular religious folklore. Elaborate legends emerged about Magdalene after Christ's ascension. One of the most popular said she had traveled by boat to the coast of Provence, in southern France, accompanied by Lazarus, Martha, and other disciples. According to this tradition, Magdalene withdrew to a cave in the Saint-Baume mountain and spent 30 years in absolute penance, without human food, fed daily by angels who lifted her 7 times a day to hear celestial choirs. The story was completely fabricated, with no biblical or historical basis. but generated one of the most lucrative pilgrimage circuits in medieval Europe. The Basilica of Saint Mary Magdalene in Vézelay in Burgundy, consecrated in the 11th century, attracted thousands of pilgrims. Relics supposedly of her were venerated in at least 4 different locations in France. And all this fed and reinforced the myth of the repentant prostitute who found redemption at Christ's feet. But there was an uncomfortable textual detail that Gregory's merger needed to ignore to work. The internal chronology of the Gospels doesn't allow the identification of the 3 women as a single person. Luke presents the anonymous sinner in chapter 7 and Mary Magdalene in chapter 8. They are consecutive passages, separated by a clear narrative transition. If they were the same woman, Luke would have made the connection explicit. He was a physician by training, an investigator by temperament, writing to Theophilus with the declared objective of presenting an orderly and verified account of the facts. Luke chapter 1 verses 1 to 4 makes this intention absolutely explicit. A writer with this level of investigative rigor and commitment to accuracy would not present the same woman in 2 consecutive chapters without identifying her. The textual separation between the anonymous sinner and Mary Magdalene is not accidental, it's deliberate, and there's more textual evidence that undoes the merger. John chapter 11 verse 2 identifies Mary of Bethany as the woman who anointed the Lord with perfume and dried his feet with her hair, but John never calls Mary of Bethany Magdalene. Never. They are 2 women with the same first name, something absolutely commonplace in 1st century Palestine. Mary, in Hebrew Miriam, was the most popular female name of the time. The Gospels record at least 6 different Marys. Confusing 2 of them would require deliberately ignoring all the contextual clues that the evangelists themselves left to distinguish them. Luke differentiated by city of origin, John differentiated by family, Mark and Matthew differentiated by narrative context. Gregory's merger ran over all these distinctions. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which includes Greek, Coptic, Syrian, Ethiopian and Russian traditions, never made this mistake. For Eastern Christians, Mary Magdalene was always recognized as a figure distinct from the other Marys. They call her Isapostolos, a Greek term meaning equal to the apostles. They never confused her with the sinner of Luke 7. They never merged her with Mary of Bethany. The Eastern tradition preserved her biblical identity intact throughout all the centuries when the West repeated the distortion. And this creates a disturbing historical fact. For more than 1400 years, half of world Christianity maintained the correct reading, while the other half propagated an interpretive error as unquestionable theological truth. So who was Mary Magdalene really, when you let the biblical text speak without Gregory's interference? The Gospels mention her in 12 distinct passages. And when you place these 12 references side by side in chronological order, what emerges is not the portrait of a repentant prostitute. It's the portrait of one of the most consistent, most present and most courageous figures in the entire gospel narrative. First recorded appearance, Luke chapter 8, healed of 7 demons. She becomes part of Jesus' itinerant group and supports the ministry with her own resources, financing a group of at least 13 men plus companions in constant displacement through cities and villages of Galilee and Judea required real capital. Food, lodging, transportation, provisions. This wasn't symbolic contribution. It was substantial sponsorship that indicated elevated economic position and radical personal commitment. Second appearance, the crucifixion. Matthew chapter 27, verse 56. Mark chapter 15, verse 40. John chapter 19, verse 25. Here, the contrast is brutal. When Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, the disciples fled. Mark chapter 14, verse 50, records that they all abandoned him and fled. Peter followed from afar and denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. Judas had already betrayed. The others hid. But Mary Magdalene was at Calvary. at the foot of the cross, under scorching sun that darkened at noon, before Roman soldiers, hearing the screams, witnessing the agony, witnessing the death. While the men closest to Jesus disappeared out of fear, she remained visible, identifiable, vulnerable. The courage this required cannot be underestimated. Being publicly associated with someone condemned by Rome was a real risk of retaliation. Third appearance, the burial. Matthew chapter 27, verse 61. Mark chapter 15, verse 47. Mary Magdalene accompanied Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb. She saw where the body was placed. She observed the linen. She recorded the exact location. In Jewish legal culture, female testimony had limited weight in courts, but the evangelists, writing under inspiration, made a point of recording that she was there. She was an eyewitness to each stage, from death to burial, and would be a witness to what would come next. And then came the morning that divided history into before and after. While it was still dark, before dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. John chapter 20, verse 1. She carried aromatic spices to complete the embalming that the Sabbath had interrupted. When she arrived, the stone that sealed the entrance had been removed. The body wasn't there. The panic was immediate. She ran to tell Peter and the beloved disciple. They came running, entered the tomb, saw the linen cloths folded, the cloth that had covered the head rolled up separately in a corner. They verified the absence of the body, and they went home. But Mary didn't go back. She stayed outside the tomb, crying. What happened in the following minutes is recorded in John chapter 20, verses 11 to 18, and is one of the most detailed, most intimate, and most theologically significant passages in the entire New Testament. Mary bent down and looked inside the tomb. She saw two angels dressed in white, sitting where Jesus' body had been placed, one at the head, another at the feet. The angels asked why she was crying. She answered that they had taken away the Lord's body and that she didn't know where they had put him. Then she turned around and saw someone standing behind her. She thought it was the gardener of the place. She asked that if he had taken the body, to tell her where he had put it so she could go get it, and then the person said a single word, Mary, the sound of her own name pronounced by a voice she knew, and she recognized. Rabboni, she said, teacher. It was Jesus, alive, resurrected, standing before her in the faint light of dawn. The first appearance of the risen Christ was not to Peter, the designated leader. It was not to John, the beloved disciple who reclined on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. It was not to James, who would become a pillar of the church in Jerusalem. It was to Mary Magdalene, a woman, in a culture and at a time when female testimony was legally disregarded. And Jesus not only appeared to her, he gave her an explicit mission. John chapter 20, verse 17. Go to my brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. She became, literally, the first person commissioned to proclaim the resurrection to the world. The fathers of the early church recognized this without embarrassment. Hippolytus of Rome, in the 3rd century, called Mary Magdalene Apostola Apostolorum, apostle to the apostles. It wasn't an honorary title granted out of kindness. It was a functional description of what happened. She was sent to announce to those who would be sent to announce to all nations. Think about the brutal contrast that history produced. The woman who received the first and most important revelation of all Christianity, that Christ had conquered death and was alive. This same woman was reduced for more than 1,000 years to a prostitute label that no biblical verse in any manuscript, in any original language, ever supported. The distortion is not just an academic error of identification. It's a complete inversion of meaning. Instead of being remembered as the first witness of the resurrection, she was remembered as an example of redeemed moral degradation. Instead of a model of extreme faithfulness, courage under persecution and presence in the most terrible moments, she became a generic illustration of forgiven sexual sin. Her real achievement was replaced by a flaw that never existed. Historians and critical theologians began to seriously question the Gregorian merger from the 19th century onward, when access to original Greek manuscripts became wider and methods of comparative textual analysis developed. Rigorous studies of textual variants, of the Greek vocabulary used by each evangelist, and of the internal narrative structure of each gospel made it unequivocally clear that the three women merged by Gregory are distinct characters, in distinct contexts, with their own identities. In 1969, during the pontificate of Paul VI, the Roman Catholic Church revised the liturgical calendar and officially separated Mary Magdalene from the anonymous sinner of Luke 7 and from Mary of Bethany. The Gregorian merger was tacitly undone. But there was no public encyclical, there was no press conference explaining the correction, there was no formal apology. The rectification of a 1378-year-old error was executed as a silent administrative adjustment, almost invisible to ordinary faithful, and the silence of the correction never reached the volume of the original error. Most Christians in the Western world still associate Mary Magdalene with prostitution. Movies continue to repeat the stereotype. The musical Jesus Christ Superstar from 1971 presents Magdalene as a romantic interest with implied sexual past. The film The Passion of the Christ from 2004 includes scenes that visually reinforce the merger. Novels like The Da Vinci Code from 2003 transform Magdalene into Jesus' secret wife, a commercial fiction that paradoxically depends on the same identity confusion created by Gregory, although inverting the narrative sign. In 2016, Pope Francis took the most significant step of institutional correction since 1969. He elevated the liturgical celebration of Mary Magdalene to the degree of feast, the same protocol level given to the apostles. The decree, signed by Cardinal Robert Sarah, then prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, explicitly used the title Apostle to the Apostles, recovering the designation that Hippolytus of Rome had coined 1800 years earlier. The preamble recognized her importance as the first witness of the resurrection and as the first evangelist commissioned by Christ himself. But official decrees rarely compete with centuries of consolidated imagery. The image of the repentant prostitute, reinforced by 1400 years of sacred art, sermons, theater, cinema, and literature, created cultural roots so deep that it became part of the narrative identity of Western Christianity. Undoing this would require not just Vatican documents, but a reconstruction of collective imagination that would take generations. The original Greek texts of Luke, Mark, Matthew, and John are preserved in more than 5,000 catalogued manuscripts and, to a large extent, digitized. The 4th century Codex Sinaiticus is available online in its entirety. The Codex Vaticanus is accessible to researchers. The oldest papyri of the New Testament, some dating from the 2nd century, can be consulted in academic databases. The textual evidence is public, verifiable, and consistent across all known manuscript traditions. Mary Magdalene was never called a prostitute in any biblical manuscript, in any original language, in any textual family, in any historical period. Prostitution was added by homiletic inference in the 6th century, not by scriptural record from any era. Magdala, the city she came from, was rediscovered by archaeologists in 2009 during construction of a retreat center on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The excavations revealed a 1st century synagogue with elaborate mosaics, one of the oldest ever found in Galilee. They found coins, pottery, evidence of fish processing facilities, and clear signs of a prosperous and economically active community linked to large-scale fishing trade in the lake. It wasn't a marginal or insignificant village. It was a real economic center with sophisticated infrastructure, and the woman who bore that city's name in the Gospels was not a peripheral figure nor socially despised. For centuries, they tried to reduce Mary Magdalene to a convenient stereotype, the sinner who was saved. But the biblical texts, the archaeological records, and the Eastern tradition tell a completely different story. That of a woman with her own resources, with documented presence at the most critical moments of the gospel narrative, and with a role so central that the evangelists themselves, writing decades after the events, made a point of recording her name repeatedly when other names were forgotten. The prostitute label was a human construction. What the documents preserved is something else. And generally, when archaeology and original texts agree, it's worth paying attention.